She was 22 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. The letter from her uncle's attorney had arrived on a Tuesday, 3 sentences long, informing her that her services and her presence would no longer be required at the Halloran and Vane accounting firm in Sacramento as of the 1st of the month. In her coat pocket, wrapped in a square of oiled chamois cloth, sat her father's brass carpenter's level, a small pocket model, no longer than her hand. Its bubbles still perfect after 21 years, the wood inlay worn smooth where his thumb had rested 1,000 times. With the last of the $412 she had been given as her severance and settlement, she bought a derelict iron bridge in a town called Dry Fork, California, sight unseen, for the sum of $87 and change. What nobody knew, not her uncle, not the county clerk, not the amused rail conductor who punched her ticket east, was that the bridge was not empty. So pour yourself something warm, settle in wherever you're listening from tonight, a kitchen in Ohio, a long drive through Nebraska, a quiet apartment in Lisbon, and let me tell you about Eleanor Nell Ashcroft, and the bridge over the Dry Fork that no living soul had crossed since the autumn of 1965. Nell had been raised, in the years before she was truly raised by anyone at all, between two entirely opposite kinds of people. Her father, Thomas Ashcroft, was a bridge carpenter and small works engineer, a man who smelled always of cedar shavings and pipe tobacco and cold iron, whose hands were broad and scarred and unfailingly gentle when he tucked her hair behind her ear. He would sit her on a wooden crate at his workbench in the little shop behind their house and show her how a truss carried its load, how tension and compression were not enemies but partners, how a well-drawn schematic was, in his words, the elegant logic of a machine given permission to speak. He died in November of 1958 when a scaffold collapsed on a highway overpass in Modesto, a sudden, stupid accident that took him in less than a minute, and what he left her, apart from a house that would be sold to satisfy his debts, was the brass carpenter's level and a single line she would repeat to herself for the rest of her life: Nell, girl, if the foundation is true, everything above it forgives you. Her mother, Margaret, had gone earlier, in the spring of 1955, quietly, of a wasting illness whose name Nell had never quite understood as a child, and whom she remembered now only as a faint scent of lavender water and the particular warmth of a palm laid across a fevered forehead. After the funeral, custody of the 7-year-old Nell passed to her mother's older brother, Harlan Vane, a senior partner in the Sacramento firm of Halloran and Vane, a man who kept his fountain pens aligned by half inches and who had accepted her arrival in his household in exactly the same manner he accepted a new file, with a small, tidy notation and no visible feeling. Uncle Harlan was not cruel; cruelty would have required interest. He was, rather, the perfect embodiment of what Nell would come to think of as the ledger book of profit and loss, a world in which every gesture, every meal, every hour of a young girl's education was an entry on one side or the other of a page, and in which sentiment was a category of expense to be minimized. He fed her, clothed her, sent her to a decent public school, and, when she showed a startling aptitude with figures at the age of 13, quietly assigned her a stool in the back room of his firm on Saturday mornings, where she learned double-entry bookkeeping in the same summer she learned to keep her opinions to herself. By day, then, she mastered his world; by night, in the small attic room that had been hers since she was 7, she pulled her father's rolled schematics from beneath the bed and traced the lines of long-vanished trusses and cantilevers by lamplight, whispering the vocabulary: gusset plate, camber, cord, stringer, the way another girl might have whispered the names of movie stars. She was 19 when she was formally hired as a junior bookkeeper at Halloran and Vane at a salary of $18 a week, and 22 when her uncle informed her that her position was being consolidated. The occasion was, of all things, his own remarriage, a widow named Constance from a good San Francisco family, who had a son of her own, 24. Freshly graduated from a business college in Stockton, and in need, as Harlan put it, of a place to settle into responsibility. He delivered the news standing behind his walnut desk on the last Friday of March, 1967, without inviting her to sit. His eyes fixed on a point somewhere above her left shoulder. "The firm will be reorganizing certain junior positions, Eleanor," he said, in the same tone with which he read aloud a balance sheet. "Randall will be assuming the duties you currently perform. Given the circumstances, and in recognition of a decade of household arrangements, I have arranged for you to receive $400, plus $12 for immediate travel. This is, I think you'll agree, generous." She had not pleaded. She had not argued. She had simply said, "Thank you, Uncle. I will be gone by Sunday evening." Upstairs, she packed a small canvas grip, 2 cotton work dresses, a wool cardigan, her mother's silver hairbrush, a leather portfolio containing her father's schematics and letters, and the brass carpenter's level in its chamois wrap. On the mantel in the front parlor stood a row of framed photographs, her uncle at Stanford, his new stepson at graduation, Constance in a garden hat, and no image anywhere in the house of the small dark-haired girl who had lived there for 15 years. She noticed the absence the way one notices the absence of a tooth, briefly, without protest, and closed the front door behind her so quietly that the brass knocker did not so much as tremble. In her coat pocket, the level pressed against her ribs with the small, cool weight of something that had never once lied to her. The Greyhound bus from Sacramento to Redding smelled of diesel and someone's bologna sandwich and the sweat of a man in the seat behind her who had been drinking since Marysville. It was April 2, 1967, and the Central Valley outside the window was hazing over with the first real heat of the year, the almond orchards giving way to grass, the grass giving way to the tawny folded country north of Red Bluff where the road began to climb. She sat with her canvas grip on her lap and her hands folded on top of it and thought, with a calm that surprised even her, of a sentence her father had once written in the margin of a bridge journal. "One cannot truly lose what one never possessed, and a house one is merely tolerated in was never a home." At a lunch counter in Redding where she spent 35 cents on coffee and a slice of pie, she had seen the handbill tacked to a cork board between advertisements for lost dogs and used tractors. Public auction, delinquent county parcels, Dry Fork Township, Shasta Co. Including 1 iron truss bridge, decommissioned 1965, with adjoining parcel 0.4 acres. Bids open $85. Dry Fork. The name had lodged in her chest like a splinter. A river that had died. A place named for its own absence. She tore the notice from the board, folded it into the pocket that held the brass level, and bought her onward ticket that afternoon. Dry Fork, when the mail truck let her off at the crossroads at 4:30 the following afternoon, was a town of 11 surviving buildings arranged along a single sun-bleached street. The paint on their western walls scoured pale by 40 years of afternoon wind. There had been copper here once, and before the copper, a river. The copper had failed in 1952 and the river, dammed upstream at Shasta 20 years earlier, had dwindled to a stony trench that the older residents still called, out of habit, the Fork. Nell walked to the end of the street with her canvas grip in her hand, and there, spanning the dry riverbed on 2 great stone piers, stood the object she had come to see, a Pratt through-truss iron bridge, 182 feet long, 31 feet high at its portals. Its once black paint faded to the color of a bruise, its deck planking gone silver with weather, absurd and magnificent and utterly abandoned above a river that had forgotten how to flow beneath it. A rusted county sign at its near portal read "Closed to all traffic, October 14, 1965. Nell set down her grip in the dust and looked up at the enormous forgotten thing, at its lace of iron diagonals against the pale April sky, and felt, with a clarity that steadied her, that she was looking at another forgotten ledger entry, closed out and set aside, exactly like herself. The Shasta County Annex Office in the town of Montgomery Creek, 12 miles east, was a single room above a feed store, and the clerk who received her, a Mr. Pruitt, was a bald, mild man in shirt sleeves who blinked twice when she stated her business. "The Ashcroft girl, is it? From Sacramento. To buy the Folly." He said the word with the affectionate contempt of a man naming a village idiot. "Miss, that bridge has been on our books as a delinquent parcel since October of '65. The state moved the highway to the new concrete crossing 2 miles south, the county washed its hands, and the back taxes and lien fees currently stand at $87.40. It is, I should tell you plainly, worth precisely nothing. It goes nowhere. Nobody has set foot on its deck in 19 months. In this office we call it the Ashcroft Folly, from tomorrow onward, if you sign here." Nell counted out $87 in 5 wrinkled 20s, 1 5, 2 1s. And 40 cents in dimes and nickels from the small leather purse she had carried since her mother's funeral. "Mr. Pruitt shrugged, sanded the ink of the quitclaim deed with a small wooden shaker of fine white sand, pressed a red wax seal beside her signature, and handed her the brittle folded paper with a dry, "Kind blessing, may it treat you better than it treated the last fellow, Miss Ashcroft." She did not ask, then, who the last fellow had been. She only slid the deed into her portfolio, beside her father's schematics, and walked the 12 miles back to Dry Fork on foot because the afternoon mail truck did not run in the return direction. The bridge, up close, was even larger than it had looked from the crossroads. Its portal beams rose above her head by more than 20 feet, its 2 lines of iron trusses, each panel 11 feet wide, marched away from her toward the far bank in 10 identical bays, its deck. When she stepped onto it for the first time, groaned beneath her weight with the reluctant sigh of a thing being remembered. 19 months of neglect had laid dust on the plank deck as thick as a summer blanket, and swallows had colonized the upper chords. And one entire lower diagonal on the north face was scaled with a great orange bloom of rust. She walked its full length, 182 feet, counting her steps aloud in the voice her father had used when he had walked her, at 6 years old. Across the smaller span he had built over Deer Creek, 1, 2, 3 panels, 4, 5, gusset plate, 6, 7, floor beam. At the far end, where a stone abutment gave onto a caretaker's structure she had not seen from the town side, a 2-story wooden bridge tender's house built directly onto the abutment. Its windows shuttered, its door padlocked, she stopped. She circled it, tested its walls with the flat of her hand, and found, to her astonishment, that beneath the peeling paint the framing timbers were sound, that the roof beams had not sagged. That the mortar in the abutment stones was tight, that the great iron bridge itself, for all its rust and its swallows and its silvered planks, was, in her father's phrase, fundamentally sound. A tremor of something she had not felt in 19 years passed through her chest. This was not a ruin. This was a home waiting to be awakened. She chose the smaller of the 2 rooms in the bridge tender's house, an 8x10 upstairs corner room whose southern window looked directly down the length of the bridge, and made it her whole world for the first 2 weeks. She swept out 19 months of mouse droppings and swallow feathers with a broom bought for $1 at Miller's General Store on the main street of Dry Fork. She cut a square of oilcloth to patch the broken pane in the window and tacked it in place with 4 small nails. She rediscovered, in the shed behind the abutment, a cast-iron potbelly stove whose flue, when she cleaned it with a rag on the end of a stick, still drew. She hauled water in a galvanized bucket from the town pump on the corner of Miller's store, half a mile back across her own bridge, and she rationed it as though it were mercury. 2 cups for drinking, 1 for washing, 1 for the small pot on the stove. On the evening of the 9th day, April 11, 1967, she lit her first fire in the potbelly stove with kindling split from a rotten deck plank, boiled a tin of beans, and ate them with a spoon on the floor of her clean, small, warm room, and thought, with the quiet astonishment of a person who had never expected to be happy again, that she had built a small pocket of civilization in the middle of a forgotten place. The one door in the bridge tender's house that would not yield was on the ground floor, at the north end. Opening, she guessed from its position, into what must once have been the tender's office directly above the abutment stones. It was a heavy oak door, 4 panels, brass-fitted, and its lock was a mortise cylinder of a pattern her father had taught her to pick when she was 9 years old. Sitting on his workshop stool with a bent wire and a length of tension bar in her small hands, She tried it on the 14th morning, kneeling on the plank floor with her father's little brass level laid beside her for company, and she failed. She tried it again on the 15th morning, and again on the 16th, until her fingers cramped and her patience with her father's ghost thinned to a wire. On the 17th morning, she gave up on the lock and went at the hinges instead, a heavy screwdriver borrowed from the general store, a small hammer. And 3 hours of patient work on hinge pins that had rusted into their barrels sometime during the Eisenhower administration. She skinned 2 knuckles raw on the door frame. She swore, once, aloud, in a word her father would have flinched at. And then, at 11 minutes past noon on the 17th day, the top hinge pin gave with a small sharp sound like a broken tooth, and the door leaned outward into her arms. The air that came out of the room was cool and dry and smelled of paper and pipe tobacco and the particular, preserved stillness of a place that had been closed against weather for a very long time. Sunlight, entering behind her through the office's single east-facing window, laid a long pale rectangle across a plank floor that had never known dust in the way the rest of the house had known it. Because the room had been sealed. On a roll-top desk against the far wall lay a green blotter, a black telephone with its cord neatly coiled, a coffee mug with a residue at the bottom the color and consistency of old varnish, and laid squarely in the center of the blotter, a leather-bound logbook with the words Bridge Tender's Daily Record, Dry Fork Crossing stamped in faded gold on its cover. A framed photograph on the wall showed a lean, dark-eyed man of about 50 in a bridge tender's cap, standing at the near portal of the very bridge on which the house now stood. One hand resting on the iron of the truss as though on the shoulder of a friend. In a corner, a narrow cot was made up with a folded army blanket. On a hook by the door hung a canvas jacket, its pockets weighted with something small and jingling. Nell stood in the doorway for a long moment without stepping inside, because she had the strong and irrational sense that she was interrupting a conversation. The logbook, when she finally sat at the desk and opened it, was written in a small, precise, engineer's hand in blue-black ink. The tender's name was Silas Rennick. He had taken up the post in June of 1938 and had signed in every single working day for 27 years and 4 months, until the entry of October 14, 1965. The early entries were brief and technical: deck plank number 47 replaced, north face lower cord painted, ice at portal cleared, and among them, occasionally, small human notes, Ruth well today. Boy laughed at breakfast. By the mid-1940s the entries had thickened with weather and traffic counts and, once, a wartime notation about a convoy of 11 army trucks crossing between 4:12 and 4:37 on a February morning. And then, beginning in the spring of 1951, the tone of the entries changed. Ruth to Dr. Hensley in Reading, spot on the lung. Boy Thomas sick with the same fever, taken to hospital March 3. Ruth past 11:40 p.m., April 14, 1951. Thomas past April 22, 1951, aged 9 years 4 months. After that, the human notes vanished for a long time, and the entries reverted to the language of trusses and rivets and river ice, as though the man had climbed inside the bridge itself for shelter. The final entry, in a hand grown thin and slightly unsteady, was dated October 14, 1965, State Surveyor arrived 10 a.m. New concrete crossing opens Monday. This bridge closes at sundown. I will lock the office door behind me. 27 years, 4 months, 11 days. It has been enough. She sat for a long time with the logbook open on her knees and the afternoon sun creeping across the floor. Then, moved by an intuition she could not have named, she stood, crossed to the wall beneath the framed photograph. And did what her father had taught her to do in every old house he had ever repaired: she tapped. She tapped the wainscoting panel by panel with the second knuckle of her right hand, listening for the change in pitch that meant a stud behind, a nail, a joist, an emptiness. On the fourth panel from the corner, a section of tongue-and groove pine that looked, on close inspection, to have been fitted a decade later than the boards around it. The sound came back hollow and thin. She pressed on the panel's upper corner and felt it give a quarter inch. She pressed on the lower corner and heard, from behind the wall, a small precise click. The panel swung outward on a hidden hinge she had not seen, and revealed, in the cavity between the studs, 3 objects laid side by side as neatly as instruments on a surgeon's tray. A bundle of banded United States currency, a small square packet wrapped in brown paper and tied with butcher's twine, and a single sealed envelope on which had been written, in the same precise blue-black hand as the logbook, the words "to whomever finds this." She counted the money twice on the desk, in the slanting late afternoon light, because she did not believe the total the first time. $4,260, in tens and twenties, the banknotes crisp and dry and smelling faintly of the cedar shaving someone had once packed into the cavity to keep them so. The small square packet, when she untied the twine, contained a pocket watch, an open-faced railroad watch, silver, engraved on the inside of the back cover with the words "For Silas. From Ruth, every hour of every day, 1936. The letter, when she at last unfolded it on the desk beside the brass carpenter's level she had set there for company, was 2 pages long, in the same careful blue-black hand. She read it twice, and then a third time, and only on the third reading did she permit herself to cry. Silas Rennick had written, in that letter, the story of his life as an accountant might have written it, in short precise sentences without self-pity. He had come to the Dry Fork crossing in 1938 with a young wife named Ruth and, in time, 1 child, a boy named Thomas. He had loved the bridge because a bridge was, in his phrase, an argument with distance that both parties agree to lose. He had lost his wife and his son to the same tubercular winter in the spring of 1951. And he had stayed at his post afterward because the bridge, he wrote, was the only living thing left that seemed to require me. He had saved from his monthly salary of $142, a small amount each month for 27 years, against a retirement he had not, in the end, expected to want. When the state had closed his crossing in October of 1965, he had understood that the retirement had chosen him rather than the reverse. And he had walked out of Dry Fork to a sister's house in Oregon without taking either the watch or the money, because he could not, he wrote, imagine spending them on himself alone. He asked, in the letter's final paragraph, that whoever found the cash should keep it and use it, on one condition only. That they possess the patience and the vision to find value in what everyone else has abandoned. If you are reading this, that is very likely you. Do not spend it on comfort. Spend it on the bridge, or on yourself becoming what the bridge deserves. He had signed it Silas Rennick, bridge tender, retired, and had dated it the 14th of October, 1965, the same day as his final logbook entry. She sat at the desk for a long while, and when at last she moved, she laid 2 objects side by side on the green blotter in front of her, the small brass carpenter's level from her father, and the silver railroad watch from a man she would never meet. The level had a bubble at its heart that was always, if you said it true, honest with you. The watch had a mainspring at its heart that would, if you wound it, be honest with you also. One was a guide to what was level in the world, and the other was a guide to what endured in it. She sat between the two of them, 22 years old, in a room whose door she had opened with her own bloodied hands. And understood that she was not going to spend Silas Rennick's $4,260 on comfort. She was going to spend it on the bridge, and she was going to spend it on becoming what the bridge deserved. She was going to stay. The plan came together over the course of the following week, on the back of a piece of butcher paper spread across the tender's desk. In the same neat hand she had learned in her uncle's back office and the same drafting conventions she had learned from her father's schematics, the ledger book of profit and loss on one page. And on the other the elegant logic of a machine given permission to speak. Dry Fork sat on the old county road between Redding and the Modoc High Country, and although the state highway had moved south, a steady trickle of traffic still came through. Prospectors and rockhounds bound for the lava beds, ranchers hauling cattle from summer pasture, hunters in October, fishermen chasing what remained of the trout in the Pitt River tributaries. What they needed, and what Dry Fork did not have, was a place to sleep that was not the back seat of a Ford. And a place to have a broken axle welded or a will trued that was not 60 miles away in Redding. The bridge tender's house, expanded into the abutment structure and the two great pier vaults beneath, would become a 6-room lodging house on the northern approach. The flat parcel on the southern approach, cleared and floored, would become a small open-sided workshop for iron and wood repair, using her father's tools and, in time, whatever she could hire in. The bridge itself, its deck replanked, its lower chords stripped and repainted, its portals cleared, would be the improbable and magnificent thing that drew travelers off the highway to see. She wrote across the top of the butcher paper, in block capitals, the Dry Fork Crossing, lodging and repairs. Her first supply run to Reading, on the 7th of May, filled the bed of a borrowed Chevrolet flatbed with 240 board feet of Douglas fir decking, 6 gallons of red lead primer, 4 gallons of coach black enamel, 40 pounds of assorted bridge spikes, 12 panes of window glass wrapped in newspaper, a crosscut saw, a rip saw, a brace and bit, and a second-hand acetylene torch with 2 full bottles. She paid $182 and change from the cash, kept a neat receipt for every purchase in a small green ledger she had begun for the bridge, and drove home behind the wheel of the flatbed with the wind in her hair and the road running out under her like a promise. When she offloaded the lumber in the town square of Dry Fork the following morning, 3 men at the door of Miller's General Store watched her without offering help, and one of them, an older man in a leather apron with a face like a piece of weathered oak, said, loudly enough for her to hear, "That's a lot of nails to bury in a dead bridge, missy." She did not answer him. She carried the lumber, board by board, the half-mile to the abutment, and she began. The first project was the deck. She pried up the silvered planks one by one, working from the near portal outward, saving those that were still sound and burning those that were not in a small controlled fire on the stony riverbed. She measured, cut, and laid the new fir planks with a 4-penny gap between them for drainage, exactly as her father's schematics prescribed for a pedestrian and light vehicle deck. The second project was the north face lower chord, whose great orange bloom of rust she attacked with a wire brush chucked into a hand drill until her shoulders ached and her hair was full of iron powder, and which she then primed in red lead and painted in coach black over the course of 9 days in late May. The third project was the tender's house itself, new glass in every window, new cedar shingles patched into the roof where the old ones had failed, the wainscoting of the office restored around its hidden panel, which she did not, in the end, cover over. She kept the panel operable, and behind it she kept Silas Rennick's letter and his silver watch and, in time, her own small green ledger. Because it seemed right that the cavity in the wall should go on holding what was worth holding. The older man in the leather apron came back on the 14th day of the deck work, when she was on her knees driving a bridge spike through a fir plank into the iron floor beam beneath. He watched her drive 3 spikes without a word. Then he said, "You're setting them at an angle." She looked up. 2 degrees inboard. My father's schematic calls for it, on a Pratt through truss with wooden decking. It seats the head against the grain and it lets the plank swell without splitting. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Your father was Tom Ashcroft." She nodded. He came through here in the summer of 1953, on a state inspection. He talked to Silas for 2 hours about camber. "My name is August Winter. I have a smithy behind the feed store. If you need a length of 1/4-inch bar drawn out and threaded, come and see me, and I will do it for the cost of the coal." He turned and walked back up the deck without another word. And Nell sat on her heels with a bridge spike in her hand and cried for the second time in a month. Mrs. Ilse Bergen, who ran a 2-table bakery out of the front room of her house across from Miller's store, began, in the second week of May, to leave a small paper-wrapped parcel on the near portal of the bridge every second morning, a loaf of rye, a wedge of yellow cheese, once a small jar of blackberry preserves, with a note that said only, from a neighbor. Nell found her out on the 11th morning by rising an hour earlier and catching her at the portal, and when Mrs. Bergen turned and saw her, she flushed and said, in the soft German accent Nell would come to love, "A person doing hard work must eat. It is not charity. It is arithmetic." From that morning onward, Nell took her breakfast 3 times a week at Mrs. Bergen's kitchen table, and paid for it in small carpentry repairs to Mrs. Bergen's back porch and, once, in a new hinge pin for her bread oven forged by August Winter to Nell's own drawing. The third of them was a young man named Joaquin Reyes, who kept the town's single garage on the south side of the crossroads and who came out to the bridge on the second Saturday of June to see, as he put it, what kind of a woman spends good money on a dead crossing. He was 2 years older than Nell, quiet, with clever hands. And he stood on the newly planked deck and ran his palm along the newly painted lower chord and said, "This is Ashcroft work. My uncle worked a season for a man named Tom Ashcroft on a bridge outside Willows in 1954. He said the man could look at an iron truss the way a priest looks at a book." Nell said, "He was my father." Joaquin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The acetylene torch you bought in Reading is a Presto Light Model B. It has a leaky regulator. If you bring it to my garage on Monday I will reseat it for you, and I will not charge you." What grew, over the summer of 1967, among August and Ilse and Joaquin and Nell, was not a friendship in the conventional sense. None of them ever said such a word, and Nell would have flinched to hear it, but a small, four-cornered community built out of shared work and the recognition, across the small distances between them, of competence honored. Months turned into a year, and then a little more. On the 9th of June, 1968, 14 months after she had counted out $87.40 onto Mr. Pruitt's desk in Montgomery Creek, Nell Ashcroft hung a hand-lettered sign at the near portal of the bridge over the Dry Fork. The old rusted state sign that had read "Closed to all traffic, October 14, 1965" had come down in April. The new sign, painted in coach black on a plank of cedar milled by August Winter's cousin in Bernie, read "The Dry Fork Crossing, lodging repairs, all travelers welcome." The bridge itself, its lower chord gleaming black, its portals free of swallows, its new fur deck singing under boot soles, ran 182 feet above a stony riverbed as though it had never for a moment doubted its own purpose. The tender's house, expanded through the abutment vault into a warren of 6 small rooms with whitewashed walls and iron bedsteads, took in its first paying guest on the 11th of June, a rockhound from Eureka named Doss Farlow, who paid $2 for a bed and a supper of Mrs. Bergen's stew and told Nell, over coffee at her kitchen table the next morning, that it was the best $2 he had spent in the state of California. He was followed, that first summer, by a state fisheries surveyor, 3 deer hunters from Chico, a young married couple driving north to Crater Lake on their honeymoon, and, once, memorably, by a Studebaker delegation of 4 elderly gentlemen from the American Society of Civil Engineers, who had heard, in a letter forwarded from Sacramento, that a Pratt through truss of a very particular vintage had been restored on the old Dry Fork crossing by a young woman working alone. By the end of that summer, no one in Dry Fork called her Miss Ashcroft. They called her Miss Nell. An ordinary day at the Dry Fork crossing, in the autumn of 1968, began before sunrise. Miss Nell rose at 5 in the small upstairs corner room whose window looked south down the length of the bridge, wound the silver railroad watch on the bedside table exactly 7 turns, set the small brass carpenter's level upon the sill where the first light would find it, and went down to light the potbelly stove in the kitchen. By 6:30 she had crossed the deck to Ilse Bergen's kitchen, taken a paper sack of the day's rolls in one arm and a covered pot of soup in the other, and walked them back across the bridge to the guest kitchen, where a hired girl from Montgomery Creek named Doreen would already be laying places for whichever travelers had come in the night before. By 9 she was in the open-sided workshop on the south approach with Joaquin Reyes, who came up from his garage 3 mornings a week to help her with any ironwork a guest had brought in overnight, a cracked wagon tongue, a wheel to be trued, once a Model A carburetor that Joaquin swore had last worked during the Coolidge administration. By 11, August Winter had usually appeared with some small forging for the bridge itself, a replacement gusset bolt, a length of railing, and would sit on an appended nail keg drinking coffee and watching Nell work, and would say, perhaps once a week and no more, 2 degrees inboard, girl. Your father was a stubborn man. The crossing had become, without anyone in Dry Fork having planned it, the social and economic heart of the town. The mail truck now stopped at the near portal rather than the crossroads, and the town's two children, Ilsa Bergen's niece Petra, aged 8, and Joaquin's small nephew Miguel, aged 6, spent their afternoons on the deck with a set of the smaller of Tom Ashcroft's compasses and dividers, learning, with the grave concentration of small archaeologists, how a truss carried its load, how tension and compression were not enemies but partners, and how a well-drawn schematic was, in a phrase they were too young to fully understand but old enough to remember, the elegant logic of a machine given permission to speak. On a quiet evening in October of 1971, 4.5 years after she had first stepped onto the deck of a bridge no one had crossed since 1965, Eleanor Ashcroft sat at the roll-top desk in the small ground-floor room at the north end of the tender's house. The room, once sealed against the world by a locked oak door, was now her private office. The desk was the same desk on which Silas Rennick had written his final logbook entry. The wainscoting still held its hidden panel, and the panel still held Silas Rennick's letter, though she had long since committed its words to memory. On the green blotter in front of her, in the pool of light from a single brass lamp, she had laid two objects side by side, as she did every evening before she closed the office for the night. One was a small brass carpenter's level, its wooden inlay worn smooth where a broad, gentle thumb had once rested. If the foundation is true, everything above it forgives you. The other was a silver railroad watch, engraved on the inside of its back cover with the words every hour of every day. One was a guide to what was level in the world, the other was a guide to what endured in it. Between them, side by side, they had become the two poles by which she now oriented her life. She thought, sometimes, in these quiet evenings, of her uncle Harlan Vane, who had, so far as she knew, gone on aligning his fountain pens by half inches in his walnut-paneled office in Sacramento. And who had, so far as she knew, no idea what had become of his niece after she had closed the front door of his house behind her on a Sunday evening in the spring of 1967. She did not think of him with bitterness. He had been, she understood by now, a man who could see only one side of a ledger book, and a person who lived inside the ledger book of profit and loss could not. By the geometry of his own worldview, imagine the elegant logic of a machine given permission to speak, could not have imagined that $412, offered as a generous settlement, might in the hands of the right person be exchanged first for a Greyhound ticket, and then for $87.40 worth of iron and stone, and then, eventually, for a life. He had done what he had known how to do, according to the arithmetic of the world he inhabited. She hoped, that evening, that he was well. Eleanor Ashcroft was 22 years old when, in the spring of 1967, she paid $87.40 from a settlement of $412 for a decommissioned iron bridge in a town called Dry Fork, in the northeastern corner of Shasta County, California. She had, in her coat pocket at the time, a small brass carpenter's level wrapped in a square of oiled chamois, and, in her chest, the composure of a young woman who had already, at 22, been dismissed from everywhere she had ever tried to belong. It was the best $87.40 she ever spent. It had bought her more than a bridge, it had bought her a life.